Okay, everybody, we are going to do beginner's tutorial series on how to program with Verse for UEFN. Because a lot of people want to make Fortnite games and they're still using Creative, but they want to move over to UEFN but don't know how to program. And we do programming here. So let's learn right from the beginning on how to do Verse programming so that you can solve your own problems instead of just copying and pasting everything. And I think this is going to go a very long ways to making a lot better games out there because we got so many more powerful tools. Okay, so I have UEFN open right now. So we've got a bare bones project open right now. We've got a couple of spawners in here, and this is the grid. This is where you build your world if you don't know how to do that. But we're going to cover Verse more than we're going to be doing world building. We'll do world building in another tutorial series. So this is the very start of what you're going to see. If your screen doesn't look like mine, don't worry about it. You can go up to window here and then put in whichever window you want. I've got one content browser, I've got one outliner, and I've got one details, and no world partition. We have place actors, world setting, message log, and they all exist here on the screen. If it doesn't look like this, just check the window menu items in here or the Verse window here, which is the Verse Explorer. This is our most important window. Actually, we're going to use the Verse Explorer to add Verse code, which in my case is down here at the bottom next to my content browser, and place actors is over on the right. So in the middle here, I've got Verse Explorer. We're going to right click on the title of this project and we're going to select add new verse file to project. Now, when you add a new verse file to your project, you have the choice to make it empty or just create what it's got here as the default code, which is a Verse device. Let's close this for a second and talk about what devices are so that I can make this really clear. If you go into your content browser, inside of devices, select this, you can see there are a ton of devices in here. Now, these devices do things in the game. For example, the advanced storm controller controls the storm. The boat spawner spawns a boat. Obviously, campfire device makes a campfire, so on and so forth. These are all devices that Epic made for Fortnite. What we want to do is we want to make our own devices. And this is very common, especially for your whole game, to manage all of the devices that you're going to put in your game that Epic has made. So we need a custom device to manage all of these devices, unless you use bindings, which we should never do, and instead use Verse. Bindings was the way that we did things in Creative 1.0, but it's Creative 2.0 now with UEFN, and we can do it all in Verse now, which is very powerful. So we go into our Verse Explorer, we right click on the top of this project here, and we say add new verse file to project. Now, when you do this, again, it comes up with this window. It's got some basic text in here for a Verse device, which we have here in a template, and then we can name it. Now, I always name mine Game Manager. You can call yours whatever you want. So Game Manager. And what that will do is it'll automatically fill in the name of the device here. So Game Manager equals whatever creative device. So let's take a look at this. Let's create this and not create empty. When you create that, it's going to add it here into the content of your Verse Explorer. Now, if we go to our content browser, we can see that in our project, we have creative devices and we have this Game Manager. We can drag this on. This is our device now. This is our custom device, this little computer here. You can actually change this to not be a computer. It can be anything you want. We're going to leave it as the little computer. Doesn't matter. But what it is your device. So just like the devices that live inside of here that all have their own icon, we have our own little icon or little mesh thing that represents our custom device. Let's delete all of these. Now we want to be able to edit this. To edit this, we have to go to our Verse Explorer, double click on Game Manager. Okay, when you do that, you should have Visual Studio Code pop up and bring your device to the front here in a black window with the code in it that we saw in the template. This is the very basic code that starts every single device that's going to live in your game. You might have a lot of these devices, or you might have just the one. In our case, we're going to have just the one. It's going to be our Game Manager. It's going to manage everything that goes on in our game. The first thing that I always do is I just delete all these comments like that. I get rid of all of that. And then what happens is it gives us this little red squiggly at the end here. That's because the onBegin function can't be empty. This creative device class is really, the way to think about it is it's kind of just an object that's going to live in your game. We call it a class because that's the common naming in programming to put a bunch of methods and attributes and parameters and stuff like that all into one thing. So it's class. So Game Manager, class, creative device means that we can put it on the stage. If you don't have creative device in here, then it's not going to be a class that you can put on the stage that you can see here. It's just a class. It's just an object that holds a bunch of stuff. But we want to be able to put stuff on the stage here that we can talk to and have talk to all of the items that are in our stage. Like these two spawners, we'd like to be able to tell them things or listen for things from them. So we have to have this device here on the stage in the scene to interact with these things. It's a device that talks to another device. So then inside of here, we've got a few lines. These are usings. So these are required. And you're going to probably use a lot more of these. If you want to use the for character, which is a way to get to the player's abilities like jumping and crouching and if they're damaged and stuff like that, we'll have to use another library, which is what this is, loading it in with using and then in curly brackets where that library exists. We also would use it if we had materials or we had meshes that we wanted to use inside of our game. We would also put them in our own library and call using. Now, we're not going to worry about this right now, but know that these are important and they must be here for the very basics. Creative device, again, is something that lives on the stage, and then on begin runs when our game starts. This has to be here. It's an override, which means it overrides what lives in the superclass creative device. Don't worry about that. This just needs to be written just like this. Suspends means that we can cause the method to sleep, which means it can just pause. We can do a thing and then say, hey, hang on for a second, now do another thing. And so that's what suspend is for. We'll cover that more. In fact, I've covered that in a tutorial on this channel. Check it out. And then at the very end of here, we have colon, void, equals. This is all a requirement for on begin. Now it's got this little red squiggly at the end because there's nothing in here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to write block, colon. Now block colon is really to be able to write a bunch of code in here. And it will, this is not code, obviously, but you would put a block of code in here, meaning like so a set of code that would run in a block. But if we just put block, it gets rid of this little red squiggly. Red squigglies are errors. If you have an error, it means you cannot build your code. So speaking of that, every time you write stuff and you want to use it in your game to do a thing, we have to build. We can go up to the top of our window here, go verse and build verse code, but I always use Control-Shift-B because it's faster. So I would have this all written out and I would hit Control-S and then Control-Shift-B, and it will ask me to save the game manager on the stage, which is different than saving the game manager file, verse file. So save selected. And that saves it there. And then if we come over to here, I'm in the way a little bit, but we can see right at the bottom it says verse build successful. If we were to get rid of this block like that, let's write some error. Save, Control-Shift-B, verse build failed, 1 errors and 0 warnings found. And then we can find these errors if we just open up this little arrow here and it will say, hey, there's a problem here. So if we take this out, save it, X that, Control-B again, it's going to say, hey, there's still an error. So open that up and it says there seems to be a problem with the emptiness of this function here. So we put in block and do that. Hit save, Control-S, Control-Shift-B, and then we have our verse build successful. All right, let's close those up. So that is the very basics of making your own custom device. Now let's cover a couple of really quick things that we're going to want to do when we start a game. The second file that we want to make is not a device class. It's going to be a very basic class. So we can go back to our Verse Explorer and we right click on this window and hit create new verse file. And then in here, we're going to put custom player. And we're just going to hit create because that's fine, just the way it is. We'll double click it to open it up, which will reopen our VS Code window. And inside of here, it's made it a creative device, but we don't want it to be a creative device. We want this just to be a normal class. So as usual, delete the comments because we just don't need them. We don't actually need any of this. And we're going to delete creative device to where it just becomes a normal class. And a normal class is a way for us to hold a whole bunch of variables and methods and things like that to manage a thing or do a thing. And in this case, we're going to manage every player that comes into the game with this class. So we'll save that and we can even hit Control-Shift-B and it will build successfully, which is good. And this isn't something that's going to go on the stage. So we can see in the content browser, in our creative devices, we still only have the game manager, not custom player, because it's not a creative device. Okay, so let's cover one more thing. We're going to learn how to talk to devices that live on the stage that Epic has created, or even your own other custom devices that live in the game. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make an editable. Now an editable here on its own will create an error because we don't have any here. So we're going to go P1 spawner, and we hit colon because we want to define what kind of thing this is. P1 spawner is the name of the thing that we want to create. You can call this anything you want in the world. So we're going to go player spawner device equals player spawner device, curly brackets. Okay. What is this? What does this do? This is so important. If you don't know how to do this, you're not going to get anywhere in Verse because you do this all the time. When we want to talk to objects that live on the stage, so it can be anything. If we put in more devices here, say we put in a basic storm, because there's a lot of games with storms in them, or we put in a button. So we talk to a lot of buttons in the games usually, or something more advanced like a cinematic sequence device, which allows you to do animation and cutscenes and stuff like that. Very, very powerful. We need to talk to them with Verse. And the way to do that is through editables. So right now I've got one editable in here. We're going to add another. So I'm just going to copy, Control C, Control V, and we're going to rename it. If not, look here, it's red again. So that's an error because we can't have two variables of the same name. So we're going to call this P2 spawner. And what this is going to represent, so we'll build, actually really quickly before I build, take a look at the game manager that we have on the stage here. And over inside of the details panel, we can see we've got visible in game and enabled at game start. We want to turn off visible in game. You would never want to see your device in the scene, I think. I don't know why it's on by default, but it is. And we want it enabled at game start. Otherwise, we would have to enable it with some other Verse code. So in this case, we want it enabled at game start, but nothing else is in here. But here's the power of making editables. If we hit Control Shift B, it'll ask us to save because we've got a bunch of other stuff on the stage. So we save that. And then immediately over in the details panel, P1 spawner and P2 spawner have showed up. And that's really cool because now we can either use the picker and go and pick the spawn pads, or we can use the list and go get the other one, and it will filter the type of object that we have declared in the Verse file. So if we take a look here, we've declared them as player spawner devices. So say, for example, we want to talk to the storm. So we'll go basic storm, something like that, basic, and then basic storm controller device will show up as a tooltip. We can click that. And then I usually just copy this, go equals, and then we create it as an object. The little curly brackets at the end are the way we create objects in Verse. So sometimes there is a case where you don't do this part, but if we leave it out right now, it's going to create these squigglies again, so we have to put it back in. So always when you're doing this, you're going to be declaring it as some kind of name, whatever that name is, the type of device with the colon here, can't miss the colon, equals, and then we instantiate this object with the type with curly brackets to instantiate the object. This is just something you have to remember. You're going to do this for every single device that lives in your scene that you want to talk to, whether it's the button, the storm, cinematic device, spawners, whatever. This is how we get started. So now we can talk to the basic storm in our onBegin. Check this out. So we'll go basic storm. We hit the period because we want to call a method on it. So that's when we use a period. And we can take a look inside of here and it doesn't show anything. You might say, well, what can we do with a basic storm? And here is something that's going to be so useful. I'm just going to get rid of that period there so there's no squigglies. Sometimes if there's squigglies, we can't do the next trick. And the next trick is to hold the control button down on your keyboard, mouse over any of these devices here, and then click. And what that will do is it will open up Fortnite.digest.verse, and that will go straight to the basic storm controller device inside of here, which will then allow us to take a look at what this is connected to. And in this case, it's connected to the storm controller device. You see, we've got nothing underneath here. Whereas say we've got a base item spawner device, we've got item picked up, enable and disable. But this has nothing because over here we have the storm controller device. So again, we can control click, and that will take us to what we can do to storms. And the first thing that we'd probably do is generate one. So we can double click this, Control C, go back to the game manager, basic storm, put a period, generate storm, and then two of these brackets, these round brackets, is what calls this method. So your game starts with onBegin, and right away the basic storm will generate a storm. And we might not want to do that. You might want to wait a little bit of time. And if you wanted to wait a little bit of time, you go sleep, which puts things to sleep. It just says, just have a pause. So we could sleep for 10 seconds and then make it go. Also, I just did something without even thinking about it, but we can put in comments by just using the hashtag. So it turns it green. So this will not run now if it's a comment. We'll delete that. So we sleep for 10 seconds. So put in here 10.0, and then we'll generate the storm after 10 seconds. So the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to listen to the spawner's spawned event. So we'll go P1 spawner, and we'll go spawned event. So we go SP, and then it'll automatically come up spawned event. Subscribe. Now I've done a tutorial on subscribe, but essentially what this does is it allows us to listen in for when a player spawns into the game. So we'll go on spawn. We want this to call a function. Actually, let's call it on player spawn, because we might spawn some other things in this game. On player spawn. Now it's red squigglies because we haven't actually created this method. Keep that in mind. If you have a subscribe, which a lot of devices have, like the button and triggers, they all have something that we can listen to inside of our code. When we call this subscribe and then we put a function name in here, this function needs to exist or it'll give us squigglies. And it says unknown identifier. This is one of the most common mistakes I see and common questions I see in the Discord channel and over on Patreon is what on earth is unknown identifier? It really just means that you need to make this. So let's go down. And the next most common problem that I see is bad indentation, which means that you don't have the right tabbing for your code. Verse is very specific on tabbing. You see Game Manager starts at the very beginning. It then tabs in one so we can create all of our variables and constants and methods, right? And then that tabs in one more time to do our things. And if we had an if statement in here, if something equals something, and then we put a colon at the end, which will cover if statements in the next tutorial, it's going to tab in again. So these tabs are very, very important. So we're going to come down here and you can see it's tabbed in after the block. That's okay. And then we'll go back to so that we're starting on the same line as this on begin. And we'll go on player spawn like that. Let's put this in as a normal function. So we put void because we're not returning anything. Again, something we'll cover real soon, equals, and this is what's going to make the method. Put block in here because it's empty, right? We don't have anything in here. So just put block as a placeholder for code that's going to come in. But you can see this is still red. It's still a problem. Like what is going on here? And it says, well, this function expects a value of type agent, not void. Because we've put nothing in here inside these little curly brackets here, because we put nothing in there, it thinks that it doesn't need to expect anything. But this subscribe says, hey, you know, when you subscribe to the spawn event, you're going to need to pass in something. And that is, in fact, the agent. So let's do that. Well, agent colon agent. Whenever we are doing anything where we're declaring something, we have to declare its type as well. Player spawner device is a type. It's a type of device. Basic storm controller device is a type again. And the agent, which I've called it agent, you can call this anything you want. You can put in anything. It doesn't really matter. But colon agent is the type, right? So I usually just put agent like that. And then we can do stuff with the agent. In this case, we might want to add them as a custom player. I've covered that in other tutorials, and I'll cover that in a future beginner tutorial here, but I want to get started with how to make functions and variables and put devices into your custom device like this. So in this tutorial, we have covered a lot, I think, but it will get you started on the road of learning verse. And there's lots more to go. So we've got lots more to talk about, but I'm going to finish it off there because these are the most common problems and common things that people miss. And that's okay. If you're learning, don't worry about it. We are going to get to all of it. And remember, your tabbing matters. This can't live here. It's going to have a problem. On player spawn now doesn't even exist because it's been stuck inside because of the tabbing, the on begin. So we can select all this and hit shift tab and it will bring it back one tab. And selecting it all tabbing, hit tab goes forward, shift tab goes backwards. So we've covered a couple of common problems. We've covered the very basics of doing subscribing. We've covered this little sleep. We've covered talking to devices, putting them on the stage, and then having editables that we can link up. In fact, we have one more editable that we can link up. If we come back to this, Control S, Control Shift B, it will build the verse code. And then over in the details panel, you can see our basic storm has showed up as something that we can select either in the list or to use the little picker and then just select our storm. And that's how we're going to connect objects in our scene to our custom device, which is going to be amazing. Hopefully that has got you started on the road to learning Verse, answered any questions that you might have of why you might get the most common problems, which is usually something like that this is an unknown identifier or whether your tabbing is incorrect. And I will see you guys in part 2 of learning Verse for beginners.